I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual now. 起立，面向佛堂，参加先鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位的传世一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. So, I want to start with what I call high-level answers. Let me reassure everyone that the high-level answers, that's not where I stop. I will delve into the details, so you don't end up looking at my answers here and feel that I dodged the question or that it's a cop-out. I will answer the question completely. But I do want to make sure everyone understands that there is no unified, formalized, official teaching on reincarnation. When you talk about the Tao, here's the most important thing. The Tao is the path. More specifically, the Tao is your path, your personal path. So we have a way that's been marked out for us by sages throughout history as being the best path to take. The extent to which you follow that path, you realize, is completely up to you. There is nothing to stop you from going on the on-ramp or the off-ramp or the intersection, making a detour for yourself in whatever direction you pick and choose, depending on what your needs are. So the path that you blaze is for yourself alone. That's the real Tao, the individual personal Tao. Now, when you talk about a formal practice of the Tao, there's religious Taoism, there's Yiguan Tao, such as this temple, and among both the practice of religious Taoism and Yiguan Tao, there are so many different branches, so many different variations. They don't necessarily agree on everything. So that's one thing, that's an important thing to recognize right off the bat. You are much, much better off listening to your inner master, the real voice of wisdom from within that comes from your personal connection to the great Tao itself. So, and sometimes I like to say this. Sometimes I like to say that, hey, there's no Taoist Vatican on this planet. There's no person that has the job of the Taoist equivalent of the Pope. So there isn't going to be anyone issuing an overall command or an overall teaching that everybody has to line up with. You are actually that ultimate authority. So if there is a Taoist equivalent of the Pope, guess what? It's you. You get that job. You get to wear the big hat. So ultimately, there's only you and your path. So now, enough dodging the question. Now I'm going to provide the answers that I hope will be much more satisfactory than to say, oh, there's no real official answer, So don't ask me. Ask yourself. That's sometimes I call that the guru tricks. Gurus who want to pretend to be wise have an arsenal of answers just like this. Oh, that question is not relevant. That question does not make sense. And then they don't answer the question, making you wonder, do they really know the answer, or do they just have these stock answers that they use when they can't think of anything to say? So moving on. Let's cover some of these details before we take our mid-meeting break. So number one, let's talk about the Tao Te Ching itself. The Tao Te Ching was written to be the summary of all the Tao-related knowledge known to that time in history, which was about 2,500 years ago, and it covered the previous 2,500 years. So all the history of the Tao from the time of I Ching, the Book of Changes, to the time of Lao Tzu, 2,500 years ago, got summarized into the Tao Te Ching. So it is then very interesting that there's no mention of reincarnation as the concept in the Tao Te Ching. and its aim was to be comprehensive. How come we talk about reincarnation? Well, that's because at that time, there wasn't a formalized concept of reincarnation in ancient China. What there was observation of cycles in life, in nature, in reality, in existence. That was it. No one formalized everything to say that, well, you see, here's how it actually works. Your body is temporary and you go through incarnation after incarnation. That would come actually hundreds of years later when Buddhism went to China, was spread to China from India. And exactly how many hundreds of years later? Well, roughly 600 years later after the writing of the Tao Te Ching. So here we're talking about 1900 years ago, roughly. So still a very long time. So Buddhism itself was not that big in the land of its origin, but became very widespread in ancient China. So the idea of samsara, the wheel of life and death and rebirth, endlessly spinning, that came to China around that time. So if you compare the numbers, that's actually like 6 centuries after Lao Tzu had written the Tao Te Ching. So this is just to give everybody a historical context as to why in the ancient practice of the Tao, there wasn't anything formalized about reincarnation. Now, note bullet number 3, the third bullet here, it was easily accepted by the ancient Chinese. Why? Because it matched what they understood about the world quite well. It complemented what they learned about the endless cycles of nature. So the idea was that if this is true about every tree, every flower, every grass, every blade of grass, if this is true about the cycles of nature that we observe, like day and night, like the seasons, like the celestial bodies, the stars, they all revolve, then certainly, it would be reasonable for us to assume the same is true for the human spirits or the soul or the true self or Buddha nature, whatever name you want to put on that ineffable, intangible thing. So this is why, as of today, and this is the way it's been for centuries, many centuries, more than a dozen centuries, traditionally, most Asian followers of the Tao will subscribe to the concept of reincarnation, and they integrate it into their beliefs. And remember, throughout the roughly 2,000 years of history after Buddhism was spread to ancient China, both Buddhism and Taoism influenced one another in many different ways. So in places, it became almost indistinguishable from one another, and there are traditions like Yiguan Dao here in this temple, where the ancient Taoist masters and the Buddhas, multiple Buddhas from ancient times, Buddhas to come in the future, are all equally venerated. So here at this temple, speaking to Chinese-speaking Tao cultivators, you will find many people who accept the concept of reincarnation. So that's the overview. That's the overview on what is widespread, what is common. Now, so far, I'm still seemingly dodging the question, like, what do I think? Okay, so I will answer that question completely. Looking at the clock, I see that we need to have a mid-meeting break. Let's go ahead and take 5. When we come back, I'll talk about my personal beliefs, and also before that, I'll talk about the way that I address the question from the Tao perspective, because you may be surprised to find the Tao is not completely silent on the subject of the afterlife. So if we can peer into what the ancient Tao masters said about the afterlife, then we gain insights as to how they apply it to reincarnation. So I want to tell you that even though the Tao Te Ching do not mention reincarnation specifically, it had different references to the cycles of reality, the cycles of nature. Other Tao sages went into the subject a lot more. So the other very well-known sage in ancient times who came about a century after Lao Tzu was Zhuangzi. So his style was different from Lao Tzu in that he loved to tell stories. So he became the most well-known storyteller in the Tao tradition. His stories were often interesting, funny, ironic, but contain a great deal of wisdom. Some of them have so many layers built into them that it really requires a lot of digging to find, pardon me, to find all the truths, all the wisdom that are hidden in them. So I had always been very interested in writing a book about this great sage and the many stories that he tells. And my wish came true when last year I was able to publish The Tao of Happiness. Zhuangzi taught that you can live a life that is carefree as if you are just wandering here and there, but with a definite purpose, if you follow the teachings, and everything will be smooth and easy, and you will avoid the pitfalls and traps that cause people to experience misery and suffering. Hence the title, The Tao of Happiness. Now, to Zhuangzi and to the other Tao sages of his time, his era, life and indeed everything could be compared to a journey. So if you look at the subtitle of The Tao of Happiness, it says, Stories from Zhuangzi for your spiritual journey. So life itself is a journey. The process of learning itself is a journey. Going through this book is also a journey. So the metaphor can be applied in many different directions and many different levels. For this particular book, it was therefore a logical thing, a sensible thing, reasonable for me to divide it into different sections that depict the progression of a journey. Therefore, the book begins with a section called Departure. That's when you embark on your journey. If you fast forward to the end of the book, you will see a whole section called Arrival. Note, it is arrival, not termination, not, the final destination when everything cuts to black, there's oblivion, there's nothingness. No, it's arrival. Because arrival best captures what the ancient sages were trying to say about life and death. So if life is a journey, then the beginning of your life, well, that's your departure on the journey of life. The end of life, what is that? That is your arrival. So that section has 5 chapters, which I have listed here, and you can tell it's rather death-oriented. The death of Zhuangzi's wife, the death of Zhuangzi's friend, the death of, and then tears of fears, and then the dream of the butterfly. These all have to do with the biggest question that we encounter as we go through life, and that is the question of death. So I think that when you listen enough to these talks that we have online, or read these stories enough and understand what they're saying, you begin to get an inkling. You begin to think like the ancient sages. So I do see an example of this when the 2 questions were asked. Hey, what is the Taoist perspective on reincarnation? I saw my friend Nate responding online, and I thought that his answer was very congruent with the Tao. So let me first share with you what his answers were. So here's what he said. This is part of his answer. Nate said, there's no concrete view of what happens after death because we just don't know. However, the observable cyclic nature of the universe around us does suggest that this life isn't our first and won't be our last. Because of this, death is just a part
of the continuous cycle, and therefore nothing to fear. Okay? So if you were to go through the book and look at this answer together, you will find that there's correspondence between this answer and the teachings of Zhuangzi. Now, of course, Zhuangzi went into way more depth and detail than just one paragraph answer would suggest, but let me show you how they map. So when they said there's no concrete view of what happens after death because we just don't know, this is talking about death as the great unknown and therefore the great source of fear. Those fears is what happens in the beginning of the story, Tears of Fears. However, observable cyclic nature of the universe around us does suggest that this lifetime isn't our first and won't be our last. In the book, when Zhuangzi's wife passed away, he initially was struck down by grief that he was not able to function. He was so sad about his wife's passing. But later on, when he had a friend visit him, he had already thought through that particular grief, and he concluded that, well, this life, we all go through the process. There's billions of years in the history of the universe. Prior to you were born, you had no life as you know it today back then. And after you pass away, there's going to be billions and billions and billions more where you, as you exist today, no longer exist. Therefore, you transition from non-life to life as you know it today, and back to non-life again. That transition is as natural as the changing of seasons. Therefore, nothing to fear. So now I'd like to go into more depth and share with you other teachings from the book. I know not everybody's going to buy the book, The Tao of Happiness. That's okay. I didn't write it to generate sales, so I'm not going to tease everyone and say that, to get the real secrets, only $9.99, Instead, I'm just going to tell you. And then if you still want to buy the book, that will be great. So let me outline some of the major points, okay? So from the death of Zhuangzi's wife, one of the main points from that story is that we think of someone losing his life or losing her life, or one day I'm going to lose my life. Note the way we say that. I'm going to lose my life. Zhuangzi points out that, listen, that life that you think is yours, it really doesn't belong to you. It's on loan to you like a library book. And that's why one day you have to return to the Tao. Just like if you borrow a book from the library, you're going to have to return that. So the transition, so that life going back to the great library of the Tao, does not represent some sort of a loss. Instead, what it represents is that you had an opportunity to borrow a book for that time where you can absorb the wisdom from the book. In other words, we have this incredible privilege now as we are alive, listening to one another, exchanging our ideas with one another. It's incredibly precious. It's incredibly, it's just a miracle is what it really is. And so for the time that we do have, we need to hold on to it. We need to recognize how special it really is. Then, and we'll talk about it in just a little bit more, then we want to recognize that the natural transition from life to non-life and back again, it's like the changing of seasons. And this metaphor is especially important. In the book, you will read one thing that I wrote, which I believe is also in my other books, which is that the end of the summer is the end of all summers. We all know this from our experience in real life. We also know that the end of a particular journey is not the end of all journeys. No matter where you travel to, let's just say you have a business trip or you have a vacation. When you're done with that particular trip, you know there's going to be other trips in the future. We know this from real-life experience. So why assume that this particular journey of life that we are on right now is the one and only, when everything else is telling you quite the contrary? So, moving on, the next chapter, dealing with the death of Zhuangzi's friend. This is the underscoring of the point that when we realize how short and precious life is, we learn to truly cherish. This is the overall point. Why in a book about the Tao of happiness, there's actually multiple chapters about death? Because Zhuangzi was right. You can't really appreciate what you have and be happy with life itself until you have clarity about death. So when you realize how short it really is, we learn not to waste any part of it, not take anyone for granted. Let me focus on the part that says not waste any part of it. The thought of non-existence is terrifying, and we can be spending quite a bit of time contemplating our own non-existence. Now, we will not know what it's like because we won't be around to feel what it's like. So that's what makes it so horrifying. But if we do that, the more we do that, every minute we spend doing that is a minute taken away from fully living in the moment and appreciating the miraculous gift that we do have. So I want to offer everyone that point to think about. Whenever you dwell upon death, think about what you are doing that at the expense of. You are doing that at the expense of enjoying the presence of life. And none of those minutes or even hours spent feeling fear, feeling sad about your own demise, none of those you get back. So next, the death of Zhuangzi himself. So here, Zhuangzi makes the point to his disciples that, listen, we come from the Tao, we have to make that great return trip. We came with nothing at all. And we're going to return not being able to take anything with us. So we often like to say, in the West, we like to say, you can't take it with you. That's very true. And it's true, just as true for us today as it was for the ancient Tao sage, back in those days. So the idea is there's no need to get too attached to anything, not just physical things, which was the focus of that story, but don't get too attached to negative emotions, hatred, resentment, bitterness, all of those. Think about how it's going to be when you are ready to make a return trip. They will be absolutely meaningless. And so what about the afterlife? Can we come to grips on the afterlife? Many people say in Taoism, there's no discussion of the afterlife at all. And that's when I bring up the last two chapters of the book. These are all from very well-known stories in the Tao tradition. Tears of Fears, the point that it makes. To read the story, I'll depend on you to just read it from the book. It would take us quite a while to tell the story and then analyze it. But let me get to the point. Why do we fear death? Well, it's the great unknown. We fear the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. That's why we have that fear. Now, we resist it because of the fear, but we also know that no matter how you resist, you're going to have to go through with it. In the story of Tears of Fears, it's represented by a wedding that this princess was not able to resist. She had to go through with it. But the other point, once we make a transition, this is important, this means transition from life to the afterlife. We will see how foolish our resistance was. So This is where Zhuangzi, the sage, is actually using the story as a mechanism to describe what the afterlife is likely to be. That it's going to be an existence unencumbered by physical constraints that we had while we were alive in a physical sense. That it's going to be not anywhere near what we feared while we were alive and resisted. So this is the statement from the Tao about that, and note that Zhuangzi, rather than to explicitly say, well, listen, the afterlife, it's heaven, you know? The temperature is always 73 degrees, Fahrenheit. The weather is always nice. There's, roads paved with gold, etc. He doesn't get into that. Instead, he uses a story and then leaves the rest up to us. Any conception of heaven as a physical place is just not fitting with the themes of the Tao and the level of Tao contemplation. So here's what I mean by that. In discussion with a friend of mine about what heaven is like for him, I asked him the question, in heaven, suppose you have a good friend that while he was alive, his enjoyment was feasting on food, that he was a major foodie. So when he goes to heaven, he's thinking, wow, this is heaven. I get to have the most succulent steak imaginable to human beings. So would that be heaven? So the first answer that I get is, well, of course, it's heaven. You get whatever you want. And then I said, well, for the cow who had to die to provide that steak, it's probably not heaven. So usually this goes into an area where there's speculation about, well, you see, it's that steak magically comes into existence. It did not require the sacrifice of a cow. So then I say, then my foodie friend is probably going to be upset. This is not real steak. This is just magical steak. Yeah, it tastes real, but I know it's not real. Okay, that's it. I'm done with this heaven. I want to go back to Earth where I can visit my favorite steakhouse. So all of this is just a way for me to make a point that if we imagine heaven as a better version of Earth, at some point the metaphor will fail. So it will be better for all of us to follow the lead of the Tao masters and think of heaven, think of the afterlife as the realm of pure consciousness. So think of it this way. On Earth, in our earthly existence, our state of mind, our thoughts, our feelings are oftentimes very much affected by external reality, physical reality of what is happening. Example, when you are too hot, too cold, wet, miserable, sick, feeling pain, feeling misery, physical discomfort, that can affect your state of mind. So that's the physical universe, where physical reality affects mental state. Think of heaven as something that's the other way around, where pure consciousness affects physical reality. And I'll leave it to you to imagine what that could be like. So in the Tao tradition, it is never a compelling necessity to describe exactly what heaven is like in a physical sense, but instead to leave it to the realm of consciousness, of metaphors, of concepts. So lastly, the dream of the butterfly, a couple of major points to extract out of that. There's a lot more that's in the book, but I'll just kind of simplify and tell everyone. So think about life as a dream. Just like when you were dreaming, maybe last night, everything seemed so real while you were in that dream, but it all vanishes. It all goes away when you wake up. Upon awakening, it's all gone. That's similar to life. How? Well, we think of everything that we encounter in life as being of the supreme reality. There are physical objects that we can touch, that we can take, we can grab onto. But then everything goes away upon the awakening from this dream called life. So again, the reiterated truism or wisdom is that it's not a great idea to get too attached to it. But then the other part about the butterfly is that it's just like the transformation of the caterpillar into the chrysalis and then into the beautiful butterfly. It's a transformation. It's a process. So caterpillar may not resemble butterfly at all. It's hard when you put them side by side to imagine them as the same thing, but in fact they are. This is a way to say that this physical shell, this biological entity that we inhabit, may have no resemblance at all to the being of pure light, pure consciousness. That is your reality. So they don't look like one another, but in fact, just like the caterpillar and the butterfly, they are one and the same entity that's going through a process of transformation. And that process to transform is awaiting you as well. It's also awaiting me. We have loved ones who have already gone through it. We have other loved ones who will go through it after us. And so life goes on. Life and death both go on and on. So now you can probably guess from all of this what my answer would be for the questions that were raised. What is your views on reincarnation, Derek? So look at the number one answer in the slide. In view of how everything works, and I'm talking about the universe, nature, everything, absolutely everything. In nature, there's no waste whatsoever. Everything is perfectly recycled, preserved. The usefulness of anything in nature, anything in reality, anything in the universe is always going through transformation to be of further use somehow, some way. That's how everything works. So if you think about that, and if you think about consciousness, you've been at this thing called life for quite some time now. You've learned some lessons. You've changed in certain ways. So suppose you say that upon death, everything that you have learned goes away. I would say that's a colossal waste of all the time that you have spent perfecting yourself, becoming a better version of yourself. And then I would say further that, but there's no waste in reality, in existence, in nature, in the universe, no matter where we look. So if you think that death is the absolute very end of the unique you, that is your consciousness, I would say, that would be a very strange exception to everything else. You will have to come up with some mighty strong justification for how that can be such a big exception. And unless you do, I'm going to assume that indeed there's no exception. Consciousness is no different from anything else that we can see, observe, theorize about. That you, the unique you that is your consciousness, will continue on. When I provided that answer, my lunchtime companion said, well, that's actually a pretty scientific way of looking at it. I'm drawing from biology, I'm drawing from chemistry, astrophysics, and indeed every other observable phenomenon known to mankind. So, 2, is there a place in Taoism for reincarnation? Answer, yeah, there is, because we see cycles everywhere in nature. So why should we not apply that to human life? Number 3, what is the Taoist perspective on reincarnation? Okay, here, this is what I get to reiterate. The most important thing for you to think about for yourself. That will be your Taoist perspective. Rather than to think about the Taoist perspective, which doesn't exist, what does exist is your Taoist perspective. Okay, as I promised, no avoidance, no cop-outs, no sweeping the question under the rug and say that it doesn't make sense. So let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，
持家三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持家规则是一鞠躬，接班一鞠躬。Okay, everybody, we are done.
Participate in the Tao meeting by joining us online. For information, go to Taoism.net/Tao.